In the previous lesson, we saw how we can affect the appearance of the HTML elements using attributes. One of the attributes is style. Style lets us specifically say we want to use this particular font size, color, background color, etc. We can also use the class attribute. The class attribute lets us put elements into a class and then apply styling to all the elements in that class. Here's another example of plain HTML. It's some memorable quotes from movies. Most of the appearance is just the default appearance as decided by the Google Chrome browser. Maybe there's some things that are specifically we've decided on the appearance. For instance, we've said this is the header, so we know it will be bold and a little bit bigger. Here's a link to another page. It's blue and underscored or underlined. We'll see links later. Previously, we saw how to make text italics or italicized, but other than that, everything is just the default appearance. Here's what we could refer to as stylish or stylized HTML. Here we're able to specify different font sizes. Things are bold, things are indented differently. And we're going to see how we can accomplish something like this using what's known as CSS. CSS is cascading style sheets. It's a formal language for specifying the appearance of HTML elements. And CSS has a standard specification defined by the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C. Why do we have CSS? Well, keep in mind that HTML, in theory, specifies the structure of the content, what information there is, how do things relate to each other, but not so much the appearance of the content. CSS is another language that allows us to specify the appearance of the elements in the HTML page. So how does CSS work? In a previous lesson, we looked at HTTP, and we said that in HTTP, what comes back in an HTTP response is HTML. When the web browser gets the HTML, it starts to try to render all of the elements, but it also looks for the CSS. Now, the CSS, cascading style sheets, can be in the HTML page, or they can be in a separate page, a separate file. If it's in a separate file, the web browser will make another HTTP request to get that separate file, that CSS file, and then we'll get that in the HTTP response. When the browser has downloaded or received all of the HTML and CSS that it needs, now it's ready to start rendering the page. For every element that's in the HTML, the browser will see if there's some CSS to apply to it, different fonts, colors, etc. If there's no specific CSS for that element, then it will just use the default. In theory, we would only have one CSS styling applicable to every element. If there are more than one different types of stylings, for instance, a particular element is in multiple classes or it's in a specific class, but we also decide to style it some other way for some other reason, there are various rules on how those would get resolved. But for our purposes, we'll just say that every HTML element in our page will only have one styling applied. There are three ways that we can use CSS in our HTML pages. Two of them we've already seen without knowing that it was CSS. The first one is what we'll call inline, which is within the element, within the HTML tag, we'll specify the style as an attribute. The second one, which we saw at the end of the previous lesson, is what we can call internal. We have a style element in the head of the HTML, and we can apply different stylings to different classes. And then third, as I mentioned, we can have an external CSS file that is linked from our HTML page, and it would be downloaded separately as a separate HTTP request and response, and then applied to our page. Let's review the first way, which is the inline CSS as a style attribute. When we're doing inline CSS, within the element tag, or within the tag for the element, we specify the style attribute with the styling that we want to apply. In this particular case, we're saying that for this particular element, for this particular tag, we want it to appear red. So in that case, we would see it still H1, still a little bit bigger font, still bold, but in this case red instead of the default, which is black. Let's quickly talk about what is good and bad about inline CSS. Clearly, it's very easy to use if it's only want to do something once. There's just this one specific HTML tag that I want to be red, for instance. It's very easy to do that. However, we saw at the end of the last lesson, If I have a lot of tags that I want to apply this styling to, it's not so good for that. And one problem also is that we're mixing together the HTML and the CSS all in one place. Not even just in one file, but in one place in that one element. We're specifying the structure, but we're also specifying the appearance, and maybe those should be separated. Now, the second way of getting CSS into our HTML pages is what we can call internal CSS using the style tag. As we saw at the end of the last lesson, we can put the style tag in the header of the HTML, and then we can specify the different appearance of different elements in our HTML page. For instance, in this case, within the head of our HTML, we have the style tag, or the style elements, and we're going to say that anything that's H1, anything that's a level 1 header, will be red and will be capitalized. We'll capitalize the first letter of each word. Now, in the bottom of our HTML page, within the body, anytime there's an H1 tag, it's going to apply this CSS, this rule, to any H1, and so this will, as before, appear red. Note that in this case, it would apply this formatting, red, and transforming the first letter of each word to be capital to every H1, every level 1 header in our web page, and not just this one particular one. It's worth reviewing at this point the CSS syntax. At the start of the lesson, I pointed out that CSS is a language, and CSS has to follow this specific structure. The first thing is known as the selector. The selector specifies to what sorts of elements do we want to apply this formatting. After the selector, we have the curly braces, and within the curly braces, we have property value pairs. The property is the type of appearance, and the value is the specific value, the specific thing. They're end with semicolons, and we can have many of them within the same selector. So using the style tag, style elements, the internal CSS, allows us to separate the content, which is in the body of the HTML page, from the appearance, which is in the head of the HTML page. It's certainly easy to use to apply some styling to all the elements in the page. It's perhaps only good if there's only certain stylings that we want to apply. The disadvantage is that if we have lots and lots and lots and lots of styling to apply, that the head of our HTML page might get really, really big compared to the body of the HTML page. And another problem is that we can't use that styling in other HTML pages without copying and pasting it, which is, of course, not desirable. Which leads us to the third approach to including CSS in our HTML pages, which is the external CSS. In this case, we put CSS in a separate file, and then we link it or include it in our HTML page using a tag in the head of the HTML file. So here we have movies.html, and within the head, we have a link element. The link element tells the browser, go get this other file, link to this other file. In particular, it's saying, go get this file, moviestyles.css. What will happen in this case is that the browser, upon seeing this link element, will make another HTTP request for moviestyles.css. We'll get an HTTP response now containing the contents of that file, moviestyles.css, which we see over here as our CSS file, including the selector and the property value pairs. Here we see, as we saw in the previous example, that we're going to apply this styling to all H1 elements. So for instance, over here, we have the H1 elements. And when we render the page, when the browser renders the page, it will apply this styling to all H1 elements, and so the header, in this case again, will be red. So now we've managed to separate the content and presentation, not just from the body and the head, but in completely separate files, an HTML file and a CSS file. And we can, of course, use this CSS file in many different HTML pages. We could also use many CSS files in one HTML page if we had different stylings in the different files. Of course, when we start to create more files, there's more files to work with, more files to keep track of, but generally this advantages of separating the content, the HTML, and the presentation, the CSS, outweighs these disadvantages. In CSS, remember I said that we have the selectors and then the property value pairs. There are three types of selectors. One is the element selector, as we saw in the previous example. In the element selector, the selector is the HTML tag or the HTML element. It says apply this styling, in this case red, to all H1 elements in the page. Now, one that we saw at the end of the last lesson was the class selector. The class selector always starts with a period to indicate the name of the class, and then the name of the class. If we had a class called address, and then we had HTML elements that were in that class using the class attribute, then it would apply this styling to every HTML element that's in that class. And last, we haven't seen an example like this yet, but when we have an ID that's starting with the hashtag or the pound sign, that applies the styling to one specific, distinct, unique element in the HTML page. It bears repeating that the ID has to be unique or distinct within the HTML page. We can only have one element with that particular ID, and this will apply the styling to that element. To summarize, we started to look at cascading style sheets, a way of affecting the appearance of our HTML elements, perhaps in a separate file that's linked or included from our HTML file. We're going to be seeing CSS a lot in subsequent lessons in this part of the course, and especially in the next couple of weeks of the course, where we're going to dynamically change the appearance of the HTML elements using CSS.